The snow had a way of softening everything it touched, blurring sharp lines, quieting the restless, and burying the scars of the land beneath its white hush. From her cabin window, Eleni watched it fall, each flake glimmering in the lantern's glow like a secret descending from the heavens. For years she had learned to measure her days by the seasons, planting, reaping, mending, enduring, but winter, with its relentless stillness, pressed against her ribs most fiercely. Solitude in summer was tolerable. Solitude in winter was a wound. Her hands, red and cracked from work, gripped the chipped mug she held to her lips. The tea inside had long gone cold, but she raised it anyway, if only to remind herself she still possessed the motions of a life. Her fire was dwindling, would stack too low for comfort, yet she delayed the chore of carrying more logs inside. Out there in the storm, silence thickened until it felt like another presence, something vast, unyielding and indifferent. The town lay 2 miles south, but she had not walked its street in months. Too many eyes. Too many mouths. She could still feel their whispers clinging to her like burrs. That poor girl, left behind, too proud, too odd. They had dressed her story in pity and disdain, stripping her of the dignity she once carried. Men had courted her once, a lifetime ago, but when gossip soured and her name was spoken with curled lips, the suitors disappeared. Left alone, she built walls of timber and silence and convinced herself she needed no one. The storm deepened. The cabin walls groaned under the push of the wind, the door rattling in its frame. She set her mug down, wrapped her shawl tighter, and bent to stir the fire. Sparks leapt, hissed, then fell. Her reflection in the iron kettle startled her. A pale face, eyes hollowed by loneliness, hair tangled from neglect. She looked like someone's memory more than someone's daughter. Then came the knock. It was not the timid rap of a neighbor, nor the impatient fist of a tax collector. It was deliberate, steady, resonant, as though struck by a hand that had weathered battle and hardship. She froze. No one sought her in storms. A second knock, firmer, carried by the wind. She rose, every part of her tightening. Eleni moved to the door, fingers brushing the latch, her breath caught between caution and yearning. Slowly, she pulled it open. Snow rushed in, white against the darkness. And there, filling the doorway, stood a man whose presence seemed carved from the storm itself. Broad shoulders bare despite the cold, his chest bronzed and ridged with muscle, long black hair damp from the flakes clinging to it. His face, handsome in the rugged solemn way of mountain ridges, held no arrogance, only an austere patience. He stood still, as though he had been waiting not just for her answer, but for something beyond her comprehension. Behind him, 2 figures hunched in the snow, cloaked and bent with years. An old woman with white hair braided beneath a shawl, her face lined but dignified. Beside her, a man of similar age, his hair silver, his stance proud though his body stooped. Their breaths rose in pale streams, their eyes calm yet weary. The shirtless man spoke, his voice low, carrying warmth despite its roughness. "One night," he said simply. "For them." The storm howled around them. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She knew what the town would say if they ever learned she had let an Apache family inside her home. They would condemn her more fiercely than they already had. She saw it all in a rush. Mrs. Whitcomb's narrowed eyes, the pastor's careful disapproval, the riders who spat when she passed. But she also saw the snow clinging to the old woman's lashes, the tremble in the old man's hand, the quiet endurance that had carried them to her door. She had been alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it meant to be needed. Her lips parted, then closed again. She looked at the man, the son, she assumed. He held her gaze without flinching, not demanding, not begging, only offering her the truth of their presence. In that stillness, something cracked open inside her, something that had been frozen for years. She stepped aside. The old couple moved first, their steps slow, careful, carrying the gravity of survival. The man followed, ducking slightly to pass through her doorway. His size seemed too great for the small cabin, yet he entered with a quietness that surprised her. Snow slid from his hair onto her floorboards. He closed the door behind him, and with it, the howl of the storm dimmed. The air shifted. The cabin felt smaller, fuller, more alive. She offered them the bench near the fire. The old woman sat with a sigh, hands folded in her lap, eyes closing briefly in relief. The old man remained upright, silent, surveying the room with a guarded calm. The son crouched to feed wood into the fire, his movements practiced, efficient. Eleni found her voice, thin though it was. "I have bread," she said. "And tea." The woman opened her eyes, gave a faint nod. The son looked up, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. In his gaze, she saw neither judgment nor demand. Only acknowledgment, as if he saw her fully and accepted her existence without question. The simplicity of it struck her harder than any kindness she had known in years. As she moved about the cabin, slicing bread, pouring hot water, her thoughts tangled. She had let strangers in, not just strangers but the very kind of people her neighbors feared, mistrusted, maligned. She should have felt panic. Instead, she felt a trembling in her chest, a warmth both fragile and dangerous. They ate little, their silence unbroken save for the crackle of fire and the whistle of wind outside. Eleni sat apart, watching. The old couple leaned toward each other as though carrying a single shared breath. The son remained near the fire, his shoulders glistening in the light, his presence steady as the earth. The hours stretched. Shadows climbed the walls. She dozed lightly in her chair, but even in half-sleep, she listened to the cadence of their breaths, unfamiliar yet comforting. Loneliness had been her companion for so long that its sudden absence felt like vertigo. When at last she lay in her narrow bed, she did not sleep. She stared at the rafters, the storm outside battering the roof, and wondered what she had invited into her life. Was it danger? Scandal? Or was it something her heart had long hungered for without admitting? The silence thickened. Then, faint beneath the howl of snow, she heard it. The steady breathing of those who had come to her door. Not the breath of intruders, but of fellow exiles weathering the same storm. And for the first time in years, she felt the unbearable weight of solitude shift, as if loneliness itself had been asked to step aside. She turned on her side, eyes wide, her pulse quick. The storm raged. Their breaths lingered. And in the space between them, she felt the trembling birth of something she could not yet name, but which would change everything. The storm had loosened its grip by morning, though the sky still hung low and heavy, bruised with the memory of snow. Smoke rose from Eleni's chimney in a thin, wavering line, marking her cabin like a lone signal against the pale horizon. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and bread warming on the hearth. The old couple moved slowly, their hands wrapped around cups of tea, as if drawing life from its steam. Nayati stood near the door, shoulders squared, hair still damp from melted snow, a silent figure who seemed too large for the room. Eleni had risen early, restless. Hospitality demanded she see to her guests, but beneath that duty pulsed a quieter unease. Letting them stay had been one thing. To step into town beside them, that was another. Yet necessity pressed her hand. Supplies were running thin. She had put it off long enough. When she announced her intent, the old woman merely nodded, eyes calm and knowing, while Takota's silence suggested nothing but endurance. Nayati, however, said softly, "We will go with you." The words unsettled her. Eleni opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again. To refuse would be both insult and confession of fear. To accept meant exposure. She drew her shawl tighter and gave the smallest nod. They walked single file along the snow-packed trail. The world was muffled, every sound caught by the thick air, so that even their steps seemed hushed. Eleni led, her breath pluming before her, the old couple behind her, and Nayati at the rear, his presence a steady weight she felt even without turning. As the town came into view, a scatter of wooden facades against the winter plain, her chest tightened. The streets were already alive with figures braced against the cold, horses stamping, shop signs swaying faintly in the wind. She felt the gaze before she saw it. Eyes narrowing, conversations breaking, faces turning to mark their approach. Mrs. Whitcomb was the first. She stood outside the general store, her hands tucked into a fur muff, her lips pursed to a sharp point. Her whisper darted toward another woman like a knife, and soon heads bent together, glances sharp as icicles. Eleni kept walking, chin lowered, every nerve raw with shame. She wanted to vanish, to fold herself into the whiteness of the snow, but the steady rhythm of the steps behind her anchored her in place. At the mercantile, silence swelled as she entered. The shopkeeper paused mid-measure of flour, his eyes darting from her to the figures crowding the doorway. The old couple stood close, their dignity intact though their cheeks were wind-burned, their hair silver against the shadows. Nayati lingered by the entrance, massive frame filling the space, his bare chest startling in its fearlessness against the chill. Eleni's voice wavered as she requested flour, salt, kerosene. She kept her gaze fixed on the counter, willing her hands not to tremble. Every murmur behind her dug like a thorn. She had endured gossip before, but this was sharper, more dangerous. The town could forgive a woman's stubborn solitude, perhaps even pity it, but to see her walk with Apaches, to see her house them, was an offense no whisper could soften. Pastor Miles appeared from the back, his presence like a shadow stretched long. He was not unkind. His sermons carried more warmth than most, but his eyes carried weight. "Miss Rosewood," he greeted, voice careful. "A hard winter for all of us." She nodded, unable to speak. His gaze shifted to the family, lingered on Nayati. "Appearances matter," he said softly, not cruelly but firmly. "You know how folk think. Be mindful." The words struck like frost against her skin. She wanted to cry out, "They are cold, they are tired, they are human," but the knot in her throat held fast. She only nodded again, the shame burning hotter than the fire at her hearth. When the transaction was done, she carried her parcels as though they weighed 100 pounds. Outside, voices rippled behind her, laughter sharp, biting. She could not catch every word, but she knew their shape. Sin, disgrace, folly. Her cheeks flamed, her eyes stung, but she kept her back straight. It was then she noticed Nayati. He walked beside her now, his long stride unhurried, his face unreadable. The whispers clung to him like smoke, yet he did not flinch, did not bend. His calm was not defiance but something steadier, an indifference to judgment that unsettled and fascinated her both. For years she had bowed beneath those whispers, shrinking smaller with each passing season. He moved through them, as though they were no more substantial than the snowflakes melting against his skin. They reached the edge of town, the sound of gossip fading behind them, replaced by the hush of open land. Eleni's breath came ragged, though she had said nothing. She could feel her shame like a brand pressed to her chest. Yet beneath it stirred a strange, unwelcome pride. Pride in having not collapsed under their eyes, pride in the silent company that had steadied her. The walk back stretched long, each step sinking deeper into thought. She remembered the days she had dreamed of being chosen, cherished, part of the fabric of town life. That dream had soured long ago, but today, in the stark clarity of winter, she felt its death more keenly than ever. Perhaps she did not belong to them. Perhaps she never would. At the cabin, she set the parcels down too hard, the jars rattling. She pressed her palms flat to the table, her body trembling with the force of held-in words. Behind her, the family moved quietly, Chenoa easing into a chair, Takota steadying her with a hand. Nayati lingered by the hearth, his dark eyes fixed on her. The silence grew unbearable. She spun to face him, ready to demand why he had come, why he had forced her hand, why he had placed her in the fire of judgment she had fought so hard to escape. But the words tangled when she met his gaze. There was no malice there, no apology either. Only a calm awareness, as if he knew exactly what had transpired, as if he had seen it all before in 100 towns, 100 winters. Her anger faltered, collapsed into weariness. She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The room was warm, but she could not stop shivering. From beyond the window, a sound rose faint against the wind. Horses. She lifted her head. In the distance, a small knot of riders lingered along the ridge, their figures black against the snow. They did not move closer, only watched. Her breath caught. The fire popped. A chill deeper than winter crept into her bones. The family remained silent, yet she knew they had seen it too. For a long moment, no one spoke. The riders turned at last, their silhouettes vanishing into the pale horizon. But Eleni understood. This was not the end of the whispers. It was the beginning of something sharper. something that would demand of her a courage she had not yet claimed. And in the stillness that followed, she realized with a jolt that her life, once defined by solitude, was no longer hers alone. The storm returned with a vengeance that evening, as though the sky itself had overheard the whispers in town, and chosen to test the small cabin's endurance. Wind clawed at the walls, snow flung itself against the windows in a fury, and the air inside trembled with the effort of resisting the cold. Eleni kept the fire fed until her arms ached from hauling wood, each log vanishing into flame with a hiss, as if swallowed by hunger. The old couple moved carefully through the narrow space, their bodies stiff with age, yet every motion carried quiet purpose. Chenoa laid out small bundles of herbs she had carried in her shawl, their fragrance a surprise in the stale air. She showed Eleni how to crush the dried leaves into hot water, the steam lifting with a sharp, healing scent. Takota sat near the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, his silence layered with meaning she could not quite translate but somehow felt. Nayati worked without asking. He returned from the storm with arms full of wood, his breath smoking in the air, his bare chest dusted with snow that melted down his skin in slow rivulets. Eleni caught herself staring once, then twice, her face heating with a shame she did not understand. He set the logs by the door, straightened, and met her gaze only briefly before stepping back into the shadows, as though he knew her heart startled too easily. The hours dragged, stretched thin by the wind's howl. Yet something softened in that small cabin, a weaving of presence that dulled the edge of solitude. Chenoa's wrinkled hands guided Eleni's clumsier ones over needle and thread, teaching her patterns she had never seen, designs shaped like rivers and stars. Eleni had always stitched for necessity, but in the elder's lessons she felt a tenderness, sewing not only to mend cloth but to remember. She leaned close, catching the faint scent of smoke and sage in the older woman's hair, and for the first time in years felt the comfort of a mother's nearness. Takota spoke little, but once, as the fire burned low, he tapped a rhythm on the arm of his chair. It was slow, deliberate, like the beat of a drum. His eyes lifted to hers, and though no words passed his lips, she understood. This was a story told without sound, a memory carried in rhythm. She nodded, her throat tight, as though she too had heard the echo of loss he carried. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, time thickened, slowed. Eleni moved quietly through the motions of hosting, pouring tea, slicing bread, mending the draft at the window. Yet every action seemed to carry new weight, as though she was no longer tending only to herself but to something larger. It frightened her, this stirring of belonging. She had lived so long in solitude that even kindness felt dangerous, a trap she might stumble into only to lose again. At one point, she found herself standing at the window, watching Nayati split logs in the snow. His body moved with measured force, each swing of the axe sinking deep, each motion steady, controlled. The storm lashed at him, yet he did not flinch. She pressed her palm to the cold glass, caught between awe and fear. She thought of the men in town who had turned from her, who had whispered her into exile. None of them had ever carried such quiet power, nor such restraint. When he returned inside, the cabin seemed to tilt around him. He shook the snow from his hair, the droplets hissing on the hearthstone, then crouched to stoke the fire. His presence was so near that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, mingling with the blaze. She wanted to step back, to reclaim the safety of distance, but her feet refused. Instead, she lingered, every breath shallow, until he rose and stepped away, leaving her both relieved and strangely hollow. As night deepened, the storm began to claim her thoughts. The memory of riders on the ridge gnawed at her. She saw their dark shapes against the snow, the promise of their return. Shame and fear wound together in her chest, until she could hardly separate them. She thought of the town's scorn, of Pastor Miles's warning, of Mrs. Wickham's eyes sharp as blades. She had carried gossip before, but never with this weight of threat pressing close. In the hush between gusts of wind, Chenoa's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. The storm outside is no worse than the storm of men's tongues. Eleni turned, startled. The elder's eyes were steady, reflecting the firelight. For a moment, Eleni wanted to argue, to insist that the gossip of townsfolk cut deeper than wind. But the words caught, and she understood. The woman had endured storms far greater, and her calm was born of surviving them. Later, when the others slept, Eleni remained by the hearth, her shawl drawn close. She told herself she was only tending the fire, but her eyes kept drifting to where Nayati lay near the wall, his long frame stretched on a blanket. His breathing was steady, the rise and fall of his chest mesmerizing in its quiet rhythm. She remembered the calm in his eyes in town, the way he had borne their judgment without a flicker. She envied that strength, even as it unsettled her. She closed her eyes, leaning against the chair, but her thoughts refused to still. She had let strangers into her home, strangers who carried the weight of otherness the town despised. Yet already they had begun to carve a place in her solitude. She did not know what that meant, or what price it would demand, but she could no longer pretend her world was untouched. The storm rattled the door once more, sharp and sudden, as though reminding her of what lingered beyond the walls. Her eyes flew open. For a moment she thought she heard movement outside, a shift not born of wind but of men. She rose, heart hammering, and moved to the window. The snow was thick, the night nearly blind. Yet through the shifting white she glimpsed it, a dark silhouette at the edge of the trees. A horse, perhaps two. Watching. Waiting. Her breath caught, fogging the glass. She stepped back, pressing her hand to her chest, pulse wild. The others still slept, unaware. But she knew then that solitude was no longer her shield. The storm outside was not the only one she would have to weather. And as her gaze drifted back to Nayati's sleeping form, she realized with a jolt that when the storm came in full, it would not be fought with silence alone. The storm broke at last, leaving the land hushed and gleaming beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Dawn spilled faint light over the prairie, painting the horizon in pale gold, but the air remained brittle with cold, every breath a plume that hung before vanishing. Eleni stepped outside, shawl tight across her shoulders, boots sinking into drifts that reached her calves. Her cabin looked smaller than ever against the white vastness, fragile as a bird's nest in winter's grip. She thought of the figures she had seen watching from the ridge, their silhouettes swallowed by snow, and a chill deeper than frost settled in her chest. Inside, the warmth lingered from the night's fire. Chenoa hummed low as she stirred herbs into boiling water, the sound more felt than heard, like a memory of comfort. Takota polished a knife with careful hands, the motion steady, his eyes lost in distance. Nayati stood near the door, silent as always, but his presence filled the space like a shield. He glanced at Eleni when she entered, and though no words passed between them, she felt the unspoken question. "Are you steady enough to endure what is coming?" By noon, the answer was tested. Hooves drummed across the frozen ground, breaking the quiet. Eleni's heart stumbled. She moved to the window and saw them. 4 riders cresting the rise, their coats dark against the snow, their faces hidden beneath wide brims. Dusting the edge of her field, they came on slow, deliberate, as though certain of their dominion. She knew them, Mrs. Whitcomb's eldest son, his jaw clenched like iron, 2 ranch hands with eyes that had never looked at her kindly, and another man, pale and narrow, who fed on cruelty like bread. The knock rattled the door with the weight of demand, not request. Eleni's hands shook as she unlatched it. Cold rushed in, carrying their voices, sharp and accusing. "Woman," Whitcomb's son barked, "you've got no business keeping savages here. Folks are talking. You'll bring shame, or worse, trouble to this valley." She opened her mouth but found her throat dry. Her gaze dropped to the snow at her feet, heat flooding her face. Before she could answer, Nayati stepped forward, filling the doorway. His height eclipsed the men outside, his silence heavier than their anger. He did not bare his teeth, nor reach for a weapon. He only stood, calm and unflinching, the storm of their scorn breaking useless against him. The riders shifted uneasily, their bravado thinning at the edges. "You'll send them out," another spat. "Or we'll do it for you." Eleni's heart pounded. She thought of the long years spent clawing some fragile piece from solitude, only to have it stripped away again. Her instinct begged her to step aside, to plead, to appease. But her eyes slid to Chenoa, who sat behind her with her shawl drawn close, dignity radiating like light from a candle. She thought of Takota's silence, carved from stone, and of Nayati's strength rooted deeper than pride. Something in her shifted. Her voice trembled but held. "This is my home," she said. And under my roof they stay." The riders bristled. Mrs. Wickham's son spat into the snow. "Then you're worse than they say. You'll regret this." They wheeled their horses, snow spraying in sharp arcs, and thundered back toward town. The sound lingered after they vanished, an echo of menace that clung to the still air. When the door shut again, Eleni leaned against it, her knees weak. Her chest heaved with breath she had not realized she was holding. She half expected Nayati to scold her, to say she had endangered them further. But he only inclined his head, a small gesture that carried more weight than a dozen words. The day passed in uneasy quiet. Eleni busied herself with chores, though her hands shook over simple tasks. She felt the weight of unseen eyes on her, the town's judgment pressing through walls and distance. She wondered how many whispers had already spun from this morning's encounter, how many tongues wagged with venom, how quickly pity had soured into outrage. At dusk, she stepped outside once more. The sky burned with streaks of crimson, fading into the gray of oncoming night. The snow crunched beneath her boots, loud in the stillness. She wrapped her shawl tighter and looked toward the ridge. For a long moment, she saw nothing. Then, faint and far, the silhouettes returned, watchers in the distance, patient as hunger. Her chest tightened. She felt the old fear rising, the same fear that had silenced her years ago when gossip drove her into exile. Yet beneath it stirred something new, a thread of defiance she had not known she carried. Perhaps it had been planted by the old woman's calm, perhaps by the steady rhythm of Takota's knife, or perhaps by Nayati's silent strength. Whatever its source, it burned now like a small flame, fragile but real. That night, the cabin glowed with firelight. The family moved quietly, each gesture deliberate, each silence thick with unspoken knowing. Eleni sat apart, her thoughts like restless birds beating at her ribs. She had chosen them over the town, chosen dignity over fear. Yet the cost pressed heavy, heavier than she could yet measure. As she lay awake, the wind rattling faint against the shutters, she heard again the distant thunder of hooves, echoing not in sound but in memory. She knew the riders would return, stronger, more determined. She knew her fragile peace was cracking. Still, as her gaze drifted to the dark outline of Nayati near the fire, she felt a quiet certainty bloom. She was no longer standing alone. The night deepened. Shadows crept higher on the walls. And just before sleep claimed her, she saw again, through the narrow gap in the shutter, the faint glow of lanterns moving across the ridge. Watching. Drawing closer. The storm came down hard, as though the heavens had broken open, hurling snow across the land with a fury that made the cabin tremble. The world outside vanished into white, sky and earth swallowed into a single relentless blur. Inside, the fire roared, but its warmth felt fragile, a candle flickering against an ocean of cold. Eleni moved quickly through the narrow space, reinforcing shutters, tucking blankets tighter around the elders. Her pulse quick with a knowing she could no longer ignore. The riders would come, storm or no storm. When the first sound of hooves broke through the howl of wind, she felt her body go rigid. It was muffled at first, swallowed by snow, then stronger, louder, nearer. Nayati was already at the door, shoulders squared, his expression carved in stone. Chenoa clutched her shawl but did not tremble, while Takota set his knife aside and lifted his chin, his silence the closest thing to defiance. Eleni pressed her back to the table, her breath ragged. For years she had avoided confrontation, shrinking into solitude rather than meet the sharp edge of judgment. But tonight, there was no corner left to retreat into, no silence deep enough to bury her. The storm outside mirrored the storm within her chest, fierce and unrelenting. The door rattled under the force of fists. "Come out, Rosewood." A voice bellowed, thick with anger. "Send them savages out before we drag him ourselves." The wind shrieked through the cracks, carrying the menace like a blade. Eleni's hands shook, but she stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Nayati. The riders' shadows wavered against the glow of lanterns outside. 4, maybe 5, their outlines shifting in the blizzard. They had come ready to claim what fear and gossip had promised them. Her throat tightened, but she forced the words free. "This is my home," she called out, voice steadier than she felt. "And they will not be driven from it." Laughter cut through the storm, cruel and mocking. "You think a woman's word means a damn thing out here?" Another sneered. "Step aside, or we'll burn you out." Nayati opened the door in a sudden motion, snow whipping in. He stood bare-chested against the storm, hair whipping across his face, his frame a wall of flesh and will. He said nothing, but the silence was louder than their threats. His stillness carried a promise, that if they crossed the threshold, they would not walk away the same. The riders shifted uneasily, their bravado thinning beneath the weight of his gaze. Yet pride is a stubborn fire. One man dismounted, boots crunching in the snow, his hand on the butt of his pistol. The others murmured, urging him forward. Eleni stepped past Nayati before she could stop herself, the snow biting her ankles, the cold cutting like glass. She lifted her chin, her voice carrying against the storm. "You've called me shameful for years," she cried, the words tearing from a wound too long ignored. "You've whispered me into exile, spat at my name, and still I endured. But I will not bend for you tonight. Not for you, not for anyone." The man faltered, his hand hesitating on the pistol. He had expected fear, not fire. Her words rose above the storm, lashing across the snow with more force than the wind itself. Behind her, Chenoa appeared in the doorway, her white hair glimmering in lantern light, her presence ghostly, resolute. Takoda stood beside her, his old hands steady on the frame. Together they seemed less like frail elders than living monuments, witnesses to survival older than the town itself. The man cursed under his breath, but before he could take another step, Nayati moved. He did not lunge or roar. He simply walked forward, slow and deliberate, like a mountain shifting its weight. The rider's bravado collapsed. He stumbled back, retreating toward his horse, his face pale in the glow. The others muttered, their lanterns swaying as they pulled at reins, their courage unraveling thread by thread. The storm howled louder, swallowing their anger, twisting it into something small and pitiful. One by one they turned, their hooves thundering into the night, swallowed by snow and shame. For a long moment, only silence remained, broken by the rush of wind and the hammering of Eleni's heart. She stood there in the snow, her body trembling, tears burning her cheeks only to freeze in the cold. Nayati came to her side, his hand hovering as though uncertain, then resting lightly against hers. It was not a grasp, not a claim, only the quiet touch of solidarity. Her pulse steadied beneath it. She looked up at him, into the calm depths of his gaze, and for the first time in years she did not feel small beneath another's eyes. She felt seen, held, as though her defiance had carved space not only in the world but in her own heart. The storm raged on, yet in that stillness, she found a warmth fiercer than fire. They turned back toward the cabin, snow thick against their shoulders. Inside, Chenoa reached for Eleni's hand, pressing it briefly, wordlessly, before retreating to the fire. Takoda gave a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried the weight of respect. Eleni sank into her chair, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. The fear had not vanished, but something stronger had taken root in its place. Dignity. Belonging. The knowledge that solitude no longer bound her. Nayati remained near, silent as ever, his presence a steady anchor. Their eyes met once more, and though no words passed, the moment carried more than speech could hold. It carried promise, not of easy days, but of shared ones. Outside, the storm began to break, the wind easing, the snow falling softer, slower, gentler. Dawn's first light strained against the horizon, gilding the white expanse with fragile gold. Eleni drew in a breath, sharp with cold but sweet with something new. She had faced the storm, faced the riders, faced the weight of years of silence and shame. And she had not broken. As the cabin settled into quiet once more, her heart whispered what her lips dared not yet speak. She was no longer alone.